Hello again, and very welcome to the chapter about the king. When speaking about the king in the middle game battle, we usually refer to king safety, because still there are many pieces on the board. Primarily, we have to think about how to make life as safe as possible for our king. Later on, in the end game, of course, the king will become an important piece, but while we're in the middle game, we should focus on king safety. Usually, we castle and we try to bring pieces to defend our king, but there are some situations where castling might not be the right idea, and also in some situation we have to choose between castling to one side or the other, and that choice can be really decisive upon the battle. Another thing that I would like to show you is also when we can stay with the king in the center. This happens on some occasions that actually it's safer to stay in the center than castling. And finally, there is a very interesting topic related to the king in the middle game, and that's the brave king concept. And we will have a look at the brave king in the very end of this chapter. So let's get going. Let's have a look at an interesting example where Nigel Short is playing with the white pieces and with the black pieces Boris Gulko. In this case, as you can see, we're still in the opening, kind of French Taras defense position, and it's black to play. Black must make up their mind what to do about the king. Well, we could even castle short, we could castle long, or we could stay in the center. But most probably white is about to open up space in the center. Maybe they want to play something like f4 and f5. Maybe the rook will come to e1. So sooner or later, we probably have to leave the center with our king. So where to go? Well, Short, in his comments, he suggests that what black should play here is first bishop c6 in order to improve that bishop. And later on, if white starts this plan of opening the center with f4, most probably the safest place for our king would be on the queen side. We could castle long here. And even though you might say we have played this move a5, which is not strictly ideal with the king on c8, it wouldn't be that easy for white to attack us here. Also, we might at some point perhaps bring our knight to the center and so on. Maybe we're lucky enough to play e5, hitting in the center. Probably this would have been the best choice for black here. However, in the game, something completely different happened because Gulko simply relied on the typical plan of castling short. Many times in the French defense, you can actually accept that white doubles your pawns on f6. Like here, bishop takes f6, that's what happened in the game, g takes f6. But on this occasion, it was a bad decision because now if you look carefully, you can see that actually all black's pieces are far away from the black king. And that's something which will be really complex for black to solve, how to bring pieces to the defense. In the game, Short quickly continue the attack with queen g4 check. If the king goes to h8 now, we could play queen h4 with a double attack against the pawns on f6 and h6, and after king g7, it's just a matter of bringing more pieces to the attack. For example, the knights. Knight e4, the pawn is again threatened on f6. After bishop e7, this would be a good moment to use the other knight, which was in a funny place, but at this point, it's ready to join the battle. Knight f4, the knight is coming to h5. This looks horrible for black. Also, please notice that at some moment, white might be able to introduce even the rook into the attack. So, difficult situation for black. Gulko in the game played king h7, and white hurried to bring the knight to the attack, knight e4. Here, black played f5. If the more solid move bishop e7, white has a nice sacrifice here to his disposal. Can you see how white could sacrifice here in a very clever way? You got it. Knight takes f6, so that after bishop takes f6, we have bishop c2 check. After king h8, black is going to get mated here. Actually, in the section about the queen, we saw the idea of building a battery with the queen and bishop, and here you can see it again, queen e4, and it's gonna be mate very soon here. So knight e4, black had to play f5 instead, but now more pieces are getting closer to the black king. Knight f6 check, king h8, queen h4. The king must go back in order to protect the pawn on h6, so king g7. And I like very much the next move from Nigel Short. It's simple but yet instructive. Short notices that he still needs some more piece in order to make the attack work. So here we go, rook ad1. Very nice. In this way, sometimes we can use the rook this way, but there is an even more concrete threat here. White would like to play queen d4. In this way, they not only attack the king indirectly, but also they're hitting the bishop on d6. Nothing really black can do about that. In the game, they tried here bishop e5. However, after knight h5 check, king h7 f4. things got even worse for black because now the bishop must stay on this diagonal in order to control the f6 square. However, when it goes to h8, it's actually complicating the situation for the king. There is one square less for the black king, and here short found a nice sacrifice, knight g5. Black resigned because they are going to get mated here very soon. For example, if h takes g5, they will follow knight f6 check, and as you can see, next turn it will be mate with queen takes g5. So, summing up, what we have seen here is that black had to make a choice how to secure the king. It was probably a good idea to prepare long castling. We could start with bishop c6 first in order to see a little more what white is about to do, but castling short was a very bad idea because white took the opportunity to damage black's pawn structure and later on brought the pieces to the attack. Please notice that if such a strong player like Boris Gulko makes this mistake, it could have happened to any one of us. So it's very important whenever you're in the opening and you're thinking about how to secure a king, please think carefully about the different options that you have. All right, let's see another example. Here we have one of those very famous games between Kasparov and Karpov. You can see that Kasparov has an isolated pawn on d4. On the other hand, he also has the bishop pair, and black has a slight problem with the king, because with black to play here, what do you think black should do about the king? Which is the safest destiny for the king at this moment? Well, definitely we cannot castle short. Then it would be mate in one move, right? On the other hand, if we castle long, this time, opposed to the previous example, it's not really a good idea because the c file is open. So yeah, white wouldn't take this pawn because maybe there are some problems coming up. It's better to play rook c1 first. So at this moment, sorry, white wouldn't take the pawn on b5. They would play probably rook c1 first. And it's annoying for black that white's pieces are lined up against both the queen and the king at the same time. What to do then? What can we do about our king? Well, if it cannot castle short and it's risky to castle long, it has to stay in the center. But also we need to connect our rooks, and that explains Karpov's next brilliant move, king e7. Very nice in this way. Our king is actually rather safe on e7. It's not so easy for white to attack it, and in this way now our rooks are connected. Not easy at all to see how to get an advantage with white here. In the game, Kasparov played rook c1, securing the bishop on c2. Of course, it was not possible to take the pawn because then the bishop would be hanging on c2, right? So rook c1, and here Karpov hurried to play queen c4. It's clear that black would be happy to swap queens here. Not only his king is in the center, which would be helpful once the endgame is reached, but also white has a structural problem with the pawn on d4, the isolated queen's pawn. So it makes a lot of sense. Here, if white declines the exchange of queens, well, black would just take this pawn. It wouldn't really make sense. And also, speaking of the king, we should see that if white plays something else, let's say a move like queen e4, actually it's white who has a problem with the king. They cannot castle at this point because black's queen is there, right? So in the game, Kasparov agreed to swapping queens. He played here the move king e2, using the same idea himself, you could say. Here in the game, black played rook hb8 and white played the important move g3, denying the black minor pieces to square f4, and the game was later a draw. However, Karpov himself explained that black could have played here instead a much stronger move, knight f4 check. Admittedly, now black is accepting opposite colored bishops on the board, but even so, after bishop takes f4, queen takes e4, b takes e4, as you can see, white must move the rook, and here black would have long-term pressure against the pawn on d4. After rook b1, rook hd8, later on black could play something like f5, bring the bishop to f6, put pressure on the pawn on d4 with a clear advantage. By the way, Karpov was a big expert in endgames with opposite colored bishops. He was really great in that area, so this would be a nightmare to play white against him here, I think. So summing up, this is the way in which black could have reached a considerable advantage. What we have been seeing here is that black had an issue with the king, where to castle, where to put the king, and finally Karpov concluded that the safest place for the king on this very occasion was just to stay in the center with the king. And interestingly, actually Kasparov used the same idea himself later on in this game. However, we also have, on other occasions, we have situations where you stay with the king in the center for more aggressive reasons. And here we have one example. In this game between Petrosyan with white and Botvinnik with the black pieces, you can see that white is threatening to give check on d6. We cannot play queen e7 because in that case we're running into knight c7 check instead. So we have to do something about our king probably. We cannot really castle here. In that case, we're just losing the pawn h5 and white will have a strong attack. Please notice that white also haven't castled, so the h file is now under control of the white rook. So what to do with black here? Well, Botvinnik noticed that he has to move the king, but probably no castling involved here. It's much better just to move it to f8. So this is a nice square to keep the king. It can also move on to g8, but the rook should stay on h8 because we have the situation with the pawns on h5 and g5, so it's not a good idea to castle. Very clever move, king f8. Now if white addresses this question, what to do with the king, if they would castle here, I'm pretty sure that what Botvinnik had in mind was to play here the move g4. Later on, what black would try to do is play f5 in order to protect the pawn on g4 and continue with h4. That would be a very promising attack for black. So that explains what happened in the game. Petrosyan instead started improving his pieces. Knight f1, that knight was not doing anything. Now the pawn on h5 is hanging, so black must play here g4. After knight e2, we have an interesting moment in this game because you might say that since black has no castling available anymore, they should try to keep the game closed, but it's quite the opposite. Black has also the bishop pair, and Botvinnik noticed that with no opposing dark square bishop in the white camp, this is a good moment to open the position e5. Deliberately, black is accepting a pawn on d5 and isolated queen's pawn because they will now get a lot of activity. Here, if white takes on e5, knight takes, black would be more or less equal, perhaps even slightly better here in this position, but most probably this was white's best shot. In the game, they played queen b3 instead. I think too optimistic, and black simply took on d4. In this way, as you can see, now the white king is a bit exposed. If bishop e2, perhaps black could simply bring the rook to e8. Definitely it's the white king which is in trouble now. So probably this was not the right idea from Petrosyan to leave the e-file open after queen e7. He had to move his king, and maybe king f1 was the best choice. Maybe this was a good idea to copy Botvinnik's idea. But okay, in the game Petrosyan played king d1 instead. I guess the idea was to put the king on b1, a kind of artificial castling. By the way, Petrosyan was a big expert in this field. He was very clever in the usage of the king, but maybe this time this wasn't the right decision. Botvinnik simply takes on d4. Now that you can see the bishop is attacking the pawn on b2, in case white takes on d5, it's possible just to grab this pawn. So in the game, there followed rook c7 instead. Now the game has become very complex. Actually, both kings are a bit exposed here, but black has a better coordination. After bishop b6, white played rook e1 and queen d6. As you can see, black is giving away the pawn on b7. Material is not important here anymore. What is important is piece coordination, activity. Rook takes b7. So one funny feature when you don't castle is that your rooks remain on their original square, and that means that in order to activate your rooks, sometimes you have to use funny patterns, and that happened here. Botvinnik played at this moment a nice move, rook h6. As you can see, no reason to try to bring the rook to the e-file. In this way, the rook gets very active. It can be used both from f6 and e6 in order to put more pressure on the opponent. In the game, there was bishop b5. White is trying to create some counterplay along the seventh rank, but no way. Botvinnik plays bishop e6, very clever move, so that both these pawns are under control. f4, white is trying the last possible options to cook up some counterplay. G takes f3, knight takes f3, and here it's time to think about all our pieces. Please have a look at the white king. We can harass this king. No way we should go and take pawns like this pawn on g3. Much stronger move played in the game. Rook c8, all the friends to the party, so to speak. It's already very, very difficult to play with the white pieces here. Their king is in huge trouble. In the game, Petrosyan tried here knight e5. I suspect that they were already in time trouble. Queen c5, a very strong move. Now the king is definitely in big trouble. White tried this tactical trick, rook takes f7. We cannot take because then there is a fork on d7, but of course no obligation to take. King g8 was played by Botvinnik, and here white's attack has come to an end. They tried rook f1, but after queen c1 check, king e2, rook c2, king f1. I'm sure you can see the last move of the game. Well, second last move of the game. You're right, queen d2, of course. Nice way of using our queen in the attack. Now there is the immediate threat of mating 1. It's not easy for white to defend here. Bishop e2. And again, speaking of the battery, here it appeared again. Queen d4, decisive battery. Nothing white can do about the upcoming mate on g1, so white resigned. Summing up, complex example, you can see that black had to do something about their king. Short castling was impossible due to queen takes h5. Long castling was not legal at this point, but even so, it wasn't probably a good option because the c-file is open. So Botvinnik reckoned that the king would actually be rather safe in the center. We have a rather closed center here, so king f8 made a lot of sense. The king was not in trouble anymore whatsoever, and later on he was able to seize the initiative here by pushing e5 at the right moment. And finally, I would like to show you something about the brave king idea. This is one of my own games. It was played many years ago, but I still remember it rather well. I thought I had my grandmaster opponent against the ropes here. I am the exchange down here with the black pieces, but I thought I had a nice attack with my queen and bishop. However, at this point, I didn't understand the position correctly. What I should have played here in this very tense position is take the pawn on f4. This was the right choice. Simply take that pawn because after white's move e6, as you can see, white is playing for mate here. What I can do is use a series of checks in order to protect that pawn on e5. How can that be done? Well, by using the queen in a clever way, queen e4 check, and after king h2, queen e5 check. In this way, we give check, we protect the pawn, so that next turn we can move our bishop, bishop h5. As you can see, both sides are playing for an attack here, but after black's move bishop h5, bishop f3 is coming up. If rook g2, renewing the threat of rook takes g7, black, of course, wouldn't play bishop f3, then they would lose the game, but simply g6, as you can see, it's actually white who is suffering here. There is no mate coming up. Even if they take the pawn, they cannot mate because the black queen is taking control of the important g7 square, and bishop f3 is also coming up. So white will be in trouble here. Unfortunately, I thought that I could simply start an attack here with bishop d5. By the way, impossible to take the rook, of course. I'm sure you noticed that bishop takes e2 would fail to rook takes g7. So in the game, bishop d5 check. I was really thinking that I was about to win this game, but that's not true at all because my opponent noticed that he can use the king in a very brave way here. He played king g3. This way, the pawn is protected. I gave check, and here rook f2. In this way, white makes sure that the king can continue its journey to h4. I gave check now on g1 and king h4. Funnily enough, there is no real way in which black can take advantage of white's king on h4. I tried in the game h6 in order to play g5 at some moment, and my opponent found a nice technical move here. We should not forget that white is exchange up, so exchanges are in his favor. Playing rook d2, not only is white attacking the bishop, but also they are inviting black to the exchange of queens, which wouldn't favor them, of course. So basically, I'm lost here. I could try, of course, to play g5, but it would be too naive to think that white would take that pawn and getting mated, right? So instead, white would, of course, play here king h5 instead, the brave king in action. As you can see, now the king will even help white in their attack. Funny, no? Because if I play here, let's say bishop f3, white could just play something like king takes h6, and the king is very instrumental in the attack. So in the game, after rook d2, I played instead queen e1 check. White brought the queen to help the king, queen f2, and I had to do something now in order to make life complex for my opponent. I tried here g5, but already this is very desperate. He just played king h5, bringing in the king. After queen h1, still black has some distant hopes of fooling white here, maybe some check and take this pawn and try to give mate, but that didn't happen because my opponent played king g6. I mean, really nice concept, no? In few moves, white had the king in trouble, and now the king has went all the way to g6. Now it's the black king which is suddenly in trouble here. I tried rook c8 in order to give check, I think, on c6 somehow, and now beautiful and very strong move by white. As you can see, the black rook is tied to the e8 square due to the idea of giving mate. So how can white exploit that? Can you find a fancy and very strong move for white here? You got it, queen c5. That's a nice one. I cannot take it due to mate in 1. In the game, I tried here instead to play rook c6, so that if he takes, I would play bishop f7 and then pick up the queen. However, he didn't let me do that because he played instead here a nice move e6. And here finally I resigned. I lost the game, but I gained an important lesson. I gained a lot of new knowledge here. As you can see, after e6, again, we have the mating idea. Summing up, what white did in this example was not to fear the black attack after bishop d5. The king didn't stay behind. They didn't play king h2, for example, because then black would take the pawn. Instead, it made a lot of sense to just move the king upwards like this, king h4, king g5. And black's attack backfired. There was no way in which they could make it work, and the white king even helped white in their attack. Summing up, we have seen a few different cases here related to using the king. First, we saw that it's very important to see to which side should we castle. It was a bad idea to castle short here because, well, speaking of Nigel Short, he took on f6 and later on started a decisive attack on the king side. It would have been a better choice to castle queenside at some point. In our second example, we saw that Karpov couldn't really castle to either side, so he just stayed with the king in the center, which was a safe place after all. In our third example, we saw that Botvinnik didn't want to castle this time because the pawn was hanging on h5. He noticed that he could keep the king on f8. This time the king goes to f8 instead of e7 because Botvinnik is noticing that later on he would like to play e5 and there will be ideas on the e file, so it makes sense to move the king away from the e file. And finally, in my game, we saw that white could escape from the black attack by using their king in brave fashion, so to speak, starting with a move king g3, creating some kind of brave king idea. All right, I hope you have enjoyed this chapter. Thanks for watching and see you in the next chapter.